Of all the characters in the Sopranos universe, few inspire as much heated debate as Lupertazzi family capo Little Carmine, son of Carmine Lupertazzi Sr. While Little Carmine's father is considered by many, Tony included, to be the best living example of old-school mafia leadership, Little Carmine himself is an object of scarcely concealed contempt and ridicule. His judgment is considered questionable, his street credibility a joke, and the general consensus is that his intelligence is basically non-existent. Contrast this with the controversial take advanced in recent years by contrarian fans of The Sopranos that Little Carmine may have actually been some kind of secret genius, a verbal Kent-like model of mediocrity, quietly hiding a Kaiser Soze-level intellect behind dull, half-lidded eyes. Champions of this theory highlight the way Little Carmine undermined Tony's efforts to negotiate a lower payment plan with Carmine Sr. over the Esplanade/HUD construction scam. Initially supportive of Tony's complaint that Carmine Sr. was being overbearing and a bit of a bully, Little Carmine has quickly turned against his aggrieved peer when the cagey Carmine Sr. says that although Tony can be a prick, he would be proud to call him his own son. The jealousy this engenders causes Little Carmine to call Tony a bit of a poseur. He begins to highlight the possessive nature of Tony's speech. Tony talking about his turf, his appraiser, etc. The mere mention of Tony thinking he owns anything of Carmine's, property or people, is enough to drive Carmine Sr. into a frenzy. He hauls off with his club and bashes the golf cart, screaming how he hates this fucking shit. Little Carmine, seemingly fickle now in his friendship, has thrown Tony right under the bus, managing as he does to disparage Johnny Sack at the same time, implying that he's weak and ineffectual, seen by Tony as more of a friend than a business associate. Now there are two main ways to read this scene, as pertains to Little Carmine's psychological motivation. On the one hand, we can choose to believe that he was completely sincere when first talking to Tony, that he came out to the links to play peacemaker, but ended up getting manipulated by his father into going off course and giving up dirt on the man. The other way to look at it is to take a cue from the genius theory camp and assume that Little Carmine didn't come up to New York to help Tony or Johnny Sack at all, that he was simply pretending to make a good faith effort so as to stay in their good graces, while actually backing his old man the whole way. The thought here is that Little Carmine is the type of guy to merely play stupid, pretending as if Carmine Sr. activated his jealousy with that "I'd be proud to have him as a son" comment, and losing track of his words along the way. Both of these views have merit, but they're missing something essential, overlooking something deep in the heart of Little Carmine that isn't readily apparent. To understand what's really happening, we have to go back to Little Carmine's first scene on screen. Take a gander at the man behind this mounting mayhem. Our first glimpse of Little Carmine takes place in Miami, Tony opposite him at a nice restaurant, the two men discussing the Esplanade business. Tony is making the case that the 40% chisel Carmine Sr. has enacted on his HUD scam is unreasonable. Little Carmine agrees that his old man is a tough nut to crack, and Tony says he doesn't want to crack nuts at all, but he will if he has to. This causes Little Carmine to attempt to shift the blame for the chisel to Johnny Sack, suggesting maybe he's actually behind Carmine Sr.'s unreasonable tax. Notice how quickly he shifts from a conciliatory approach to assigning responsibility to Johnny Sack. Notice how every time there's a disagreement, somebody not in the room gets thrown under the bus. The reason Tony doesn't pick up on this is because Little Carmine follows up his seed of doubt speculation by launching into an anecdote so strange that it all but obliterates any of his previous points. He starts talking about history, abruptly going into a bizarre story about Louis the Whatever's finance minister, a government functionary whose beautiful chateau outshone even the king's palace in Versailles. The king, he said, ended up clapping the finance minister in irons. Tony stares at him like a lobotomy patient, completely transfixed by his host's apparent idiocy. But let's break down what Little Carmine might actually be saying here. The story he relates is based on actual events. Louis the Whatever was Louis XIV, King of France from 1643 until 1715. The finance minister he mentions was a man named Nicolas Fouquet, described in Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power as a generous man who loved lavish parties, pretty women, and poetry. Concerned that he was falling out of favor with the king, Fouquet decided to throw a massive party for him at his previously mentioned chateau. All the big names came: La Fontaine, La Rochefoucauld, Napoleon, who knows? I'm not a historian. The point is that this was a very swanky affair, as little Carmine intimated. Lots of great food, amazing entertainment, the works. The problem, according to Robert Greene, is that Louis XIV was a paranoid and miserable bastard, very insecure. His finance minister may have impressed him, but he impressed a lot of other people besides. In effect, he outshone the king, as little Carmine points out. By making the king's residence at Versailles, which is, by the way, the more or less correct way to pronounce the word, look like a pile of not-so-fancy French dog shit, he made the king look like a not-so-fancy pile of French dog shit, too. And that's a good way to get clapped in irons. Carmine tells Tony the story about Fouquet and the king because he's trying to make a larger point about people getting greedy, people not knowing their place, not respecting tradition. Johnny Sack, little Carmine is telling Tony, is a Fouquet-like interloper, a pissant peasant with too much pride. Johnny Sack is a commoner who has gotten too big for his britches, the type of guy who doesn't know which hand to hold his knife and fork in, the kind of vulgar asshole who grew up using Wonder Bread to mop up his Sunday gravy. Little Carmine lights a cigar and tells Tony he'll look into the situation. Tony, unaware of what's just been relayed, not able to read the tea leaves when presented by somebody so clearly beneath him, tells little Carmine he understands he has to tread carefully so as to not piss off his old man, to which little Carmine says, "I haven't been afraid of my father for quite some time." This, too, passes without notice, Tony being focused on Carmine Sr. as the source of his problems. He even goes so far as to say he's going to talk to Johnny Sack as well, letting Carmine know that he's just making the rounds, consulting jesters and ministers in the king's court as needed. Flash forward to Carmine Sr.'s death, stroking out and choking on chicken salad at yet another golf course, babbling about gherkins and burning hair, while Johnny Sack says he can only smell cut grass. The king is dying now. The king is dead. We cut from his medical emergency to little Carmine getting the call. From the poolside in Miami to Tony and Johnny shooting the shit in the hospital where Carmine's soon to expire, rehashing the plan Tony abandoned that would have seen the old man riddled with bullets. In true scumbag fashion, Johnny comes to Carmine's room and even hugs it out with little Carmine, telling him they're all praying for the old man. Little Carmine, seemingly sincere, apparently touched by the gesture, tells Johnny that Carmine Sr. considered him another son. The funeral that follows shows the mafia in all its elaborate phoniness. Capos and soldiers and associates hugging each other and slapping backs, cracking jokes and politicking before the boss is even buried. There's a dust-up between little Carmine and Johnny Sack over an Opus Dei medal on Carmine Sr.'s rosary, the fight ostensibly about whether or not John's wife snuck it in there against Carmine's wishes, but really the scuffle being about two men jockeying over the throne in the Lupertazzi legacy. A series of misfortunes follows. Johnny sends a recently paroled Phil Leotardo to deliver the message to Lorraine Caluzzo that she needs to start kicking up to Johnny instead of little Carmine. Lorraine runs to Tony for protection, and Tony ends up attempting to mediate the dispute in much the same fashion little Carmine did the HUD issue between him and Carmine Sr., but the meeting he has with Johnny Sack gets blown up by Christopher Moltisanti's dumbass speaking out of turn. What could have been a minor pissing match now escalates into a Trump Tower golden shower when Phil Leotardo's brother Billy comes through and kills Lorraine. We see little Carmine react to the news by blaming Phil Leotardo, only to get corrected by Rusty Emilio, who accurately, if self-servingly, explains that it's actually Johnny Sack calling the shots. That little Carmine would even leap to the conclusion that Phil was the one putting the squeeze on Lorraine is, of course, preposterous, but little Carmine has already spent a lifetime ensuring that people think he doesn't have two brain cells to rub together, so nobody even blinks. The evidence for little Carmine being a terrible leader, alternately a mental midget or total chicken shit, continues to accrue as the war unfolds. Rusty Emilio gets in his ear and gasses him up, tells him he might be a stronger man than his father even, that if they take the fight to Johnny Sack, the street guys in New York will all back them. He sells the conflict like Dick Cheney talking about invading Iraq, pushing little Carmine like a pawn up his chessboard. Mission creep takes over and a spun-out Tony Blundetto kills not only Joey Peeps, but Billy Leotardo in revenge for his friend Angelo's murder. The knowledge of what Phil will do should he capture Blundetto forces Tony, who warned his idiot cousin to stay out of things in the first place, to blow Blundetto off the porch of his country safe house with a well-timed shotgun blast. It's at this point that little Carmine goes from courageously dumb to outright cowardly. He's let Johnny Sack off his cousin Lorraine, sink his yacht, and kill his old man's consigliere, mostly because he chose to go after Sack surreptitiously, running some Cold War-style Contra versus Sandinistas type shenanigans when he could have just dropped on New York like Hiroshima or sent in a team to knock Johnny Sack out the frame directly. Failing to make a dent in Johnny's power structure, he backs down, a seemingly broken man. The next few episodes reveal the toll of little Carmine's supposed miscalculations. Phil Leotardo becomes even more unhinged than before, threatening to exact revenge for his brother's death by going after Christopher Moltisanti since he can't get a Blundetto. Tony is forced to give up a percentage of Tony B's casino income to Phil as tribute, furthering the bad blood between him and Johnny Sack after Sack rips him off on a Vesma shipment at the port. Then Johnny Sack, shortly after becoming boss of the Lupertazzi family, is taken down by the FBI after Jimmy Petrillo rats him out. Notice who skates by in all this. The dunce down in Miami. The half-assed wise guy who fixes wet t-shirt contests and craps out lousy porn. Who's indirectly responsible for the deaths of a half-dozen people that we know of. This guy, who's up to his balls in illicit activity, whose arch-enemy's rat friend must have surely had dirt on him, with a legendary last name nobody thinks he deserves, gets no heat from the feds, no warrant served at his door, nor smoke from any corner. Time goes by. Systems tend toward disorder. Under Phil Leotardo's questionable leadership, Sopranos associate Hesh Rabkin and his son-in-law Eli are knocked around by Lupertazzi soldiers, supposedly the result of a misunderstanding. They're paid off with a pittance. Christopher Moltisanti goes Hollywood and gets to work on a thinly veiled revenge fantasy against Tony called Cleaver, with Little Carmine backing production. Rusty Milio, the man who many assume maneuvered Little Carmine into his disastrous bid for the throne in the first place, ends up riddled with bullets as a result of a favor Johnny Sack convinces Tony he owes. Johnny continues to behave like a medieval baron, pushing Tony to do things he doesn't particularly care to do, while Tony works what leverage he has to get Janice and Bobby Johnny's old home at a steep discount. He also fucks him on a deal with Phil, which doesn't lead anywhere in terms of true friendship. Phil's intense homophobia requires him to have Vito killed, and Tony's love of the tremendous money Vito brought in forces him to tap criminal mastermind Benny Fazio to blow up Phil's wire room. The Cold War that got too hot for Little Carmine heats up again, only this time he's nowhere near the flames. Indeed, when things slow down, he's able to take on the role traditionally held by his father, mediator of the conflict, a clear sign of enhanced standing. This is when the Carmine must be a genius camp frequently chimes in. At the sit-down between Tony and Phil, just as things are getting smoothed over, Little Carmine blows it all up with his "whatever happened there" comment about Billy getting whacked by Blundetto. People who see Little Carmine for the malapropism-spewing machine that he is, the bug-eyed idiot raconteur who may or may not be as effective as a boss like his dad was, but general consensus is quite possibly retarded, can only take this latest blunder as evidence of an eerily consistent tendency towards saying the worst possible thing at the worst possible time. And yet this comment about Phil's brother is so left field in the context of what's being discussed that it feels more malicious than stupid. We have to remember what happened on the golf course when Tony first asked Little Carmine to intervene with his father on the Esplanade issue. Carmine Sr., a pretty sedate, reasonable fella to begin with, went absolutely bananas with a golf club. Phil, on the other hand, is obviously a hothead. Granted, he did do 20 years in the can, which he doesn't like to talk about, but will, if pressed on the matter. So it's understandable that he would have a much more violent reaction. The question becomes how Little Carmine is able to get this sort of reaction out of people in general, stirring up conflicts that barely affect him, reigniting fires that are nearly out, and catching none of the flack on such a consistent basis. Is he perfectly clumsy and dumb and lucky at the same exact time? Is there anyone more fortunate in their incompetence than this man? Because what happens next leaves him in an ideal situation. First, Phil celebrates his latest volcanic eruption with a classic rage-induced heart attack. He doesn't die, but he gets to go where he's undoubtedly sent so many other people during his wildly violent life, straight to the hospital. Tony goes to visit him, talks about his own experience with the coma he was in, conveniently leaving out the part where he hangs out with his cousin Blundetto, and they seem to bury the hatchet. Next, Johnny Sack dies of cancer, which is great news for Little Carmine. Not only does Sack go down for the dirt nap, he does so sidelined from power, basically forgotten by anyone who ever feared or respected him. This leads to a schism within the New York power structure itself. Jerry the Hairdo is put forth as prospective new boss, and immediately taken out of the running by Doc Santoro. Phil, pissy about that, but basically accepting of business as usual, overlooks the faux pas until the new boss does something unpardonable, picks food off his plate. Naturally, the only response to that is to have him shot in the eyeball outside of a whorehouse. Because little Carmine isn't insane, he declines Tony's suggestion that he put his name back in the hat to become boss of what's become a completely cannibalistic organization. He relays the Hollywood-level line his wife supposedly laid on him about how she doesn't want to be the wealthiest widow on Long Island. Then he lets Christopher Moltisanti blindside Tony with a subconscious death threat in the form of a low-rent horror flick he helped finance. After this, Tony and Chris's relationship reaches its lowest point, Chris literally dying at Tony's hand as Tony pinches his nose shut after a car accident, forcing him to choke on his own blood. This is where Tony loses his soul completely. He feels nothing for Chris and not much in general. He goes to Vegas with Chris's mistress and does peyote, screws her, collapses on the floor of a casino laughing. He beefs with Phil with no attempt to be conciliatory, cutting 2 of his guys off from construction revenue. Then he beats the ever-living shit out of Phil's guy Coco, who admittedly deserves every bit of it for threatening Meadow, lewdly and in public. Once again, little Carmine steps in to mediate, but it's far too late. Phil is so enraged that he's become some kind of shitty transformer, turned into a goddamn house. He orders the deaths of Tony, Silvio, and Bobby. Tony gets wind of this and brings back the Zips who laid out Rusty Milio. It doesn't happen fast enough, though, and Bobby gets killed instead. Silvio put in a coma. Patsy Parisi, interestingly, finds a way to narrowly avoid the lead. Tony's capo Carlo, who got screwed on the Vespa deal, flips, and Tony is informed that he'll likely testify against him soon. More fallout from the conflict with Phil. Then Phil gets his, shot in his silver mane outside a gas station where they don't even work the pumps, his head run over by a weirdly prominent Ford Explorer, and the worst product placement of all time. The usual theory is that Tony is killed in turn by the episode's end, taken out by the man in the members-only jacket inside Holston's, in full view of his family. But even if this isn't how it goes down, Tony is finished. Carlo's testimony will sink him, send him to prison for the rest of his life, or put him in the witness protection program if he agrees to flip on whoever takes over for the Lupertazis. Which brings us to the final round of questions. What happens to little Carmine? What role did he play in all this mayhem? The one thing we know about the way this man operates is that he tailors his message to his audience. In front of Tony Soprano, Carmine Sr. is a tough nut to crack. In front of Carmine Sr., Tony is a bit of a poseur. Behind closed doors, Johnny Sack is pragmatic, but a greedy motherfucker. This backbiting is tempered by moments of apparent transparency, off-the-cuff comments that eventually lead to violence. Remember the golf course conversation where little Carmine reflects on how maybe the sticking post is that Johnny Sack and Tony are more friends than business associates? He says this in front of Johnny as a means of undercutting him, but only after Carmine Sr. comes at him with that "I would have been proud to call him my own son" line about Tony. Later on in the sit-down with Phil, little Carmine pulls a similar card, throwing out that "whatever happened there" as if it's simply an ill-timed conciliatory gesture. In both instances, he gets away with it because people think he's just too stupid to know any better. Childish jealousy made him sour on Tony after his old man suddenly shaded him with the son comment. Whatever happened there slips by without any sense of suspicion, because it's preceded by him saying that a pint of blood costs more than a gallon of gold. In every instance, little Carmine is able to poison the well without anyone thinking he means to. They assume he's a bumbling idiot because he gives them every reason to think this. They figure him incapable of real calculation, a child playing checkers while the masters play chess. There's an alternate history story by the science fiction author Robert Silverberg called With Caesar in the Underworld. It's about an ambassador from the Byzantine Empire visiting Rome to arrange a marriage between the son of the Roman Empire and the daughter of the Byzantine side. The emperor is on his deathbed, and the Roman son, the eldest who will be the next emperor, is away on a hunting trip, so the younger son, Maximilianus, is tasked with entertaining the visiting ambassador. They drink and screw their way through the Roman equivalent of the red light district, their licentious journey revealing the younger son's debauched and dissolute lifestyle, and contrasting that with his straight-laced older brother, who is clearly the better choice to lead Rome when the time comes. And yet, all is not as it seems. By the time the sun rises over Rome, word gets back that the older brother has died in a hunting accident, and that Roman rule will fall to Maximilianus, the heir apparent. Showing himself to be more than willing to take on the mantle of leadership, with a series of bold administrative decisions made in swift order, the apparent fuck-up rises to the occasion and embarks on a successful military campaign against the barbarians at Rome's gates, extending Roman rule for centuries to come. The conspiratorially minded might see a possible parallel between this story and that of little Carmine. Think about what could be happening off-screen. Suppose Patsy Parisi is contacted by little Carmine at some point in the war, reminded about his brother's untimely death during the Tony Jr. conflict in the same way Phil is reminded about Billy. Suppose he backchannels with them the same way Tony backchannels with Butchie to bring about Phil's downfall. That fade to black cut at the end starts to make a lot more sense. Suppose, too, that little Carmine was a rat himself. Why else would a high-level Lupertazzi capo not go down when Johnny Sack's old consigliere flipped? This guy was active his whole life. His last name is synonymous with the organization his family ran. Feds would look at him like a trussed-up turkey, a prize pig, a goddamn trophy to stuff and mount over their string and postcard wall. Then there's the personalities he played with. He sends Angelo and Rusty to tap Blundetto for the Joey Peeps hit, despite the fact that Blundetto's just beating the hell out of his boss at the laundromat and is clearly unstable. He funds Christopher Moltisanti's movie Cleaver, knowing about Chris's substance abuse issues and general chafing under authority, his problems with Tony and how that's likely to present. He goads Phil into rekindling the conflagration at the meeting of the minds he himself organized, keeping him in play as an agent of chaos, and in so doing, destabilizing both the Lupertazzi pretenders and their soprano vassals. I'm not saying that little Carmine is necessarily a genius. What strikes me as most likely is that he's the type of man whose strengths are overlooked and whose weaknesses are massively magnified in the eyes of his peers. Intentionally or not, he bends people's perceptions around him, making himself seem ridiculous at times and at other times simply harmless. When Carmine Sr. kicks the bucket, Johnny Sack doesn't wait for the worms to get their first taste before he sends Billy Leotardo and Joey Peeps over to cool out Lorraine Coluzzo. He's had it in his mind since Ralph Cifaretto cracked wise about his wife's ass that the Lupertazzis needed to step down from the throne, and he was far from alone in this assessment. In all likelihood, Carmine Sr. didn't think that his son should run things either. He had spent his entire existence building the family up, relegating Junior to a playboy's life down in Miami, while he staffed his organization with wolves who would just as soon eat their own children. Phil, Rusty, Doc Santoro, Butchie, not one of these guys has any qualms about spilling somebody's brains in the street or digging a hole. They looked at little Carmine and they saw food. But little Carmine might have seen something else. The story he tells Tony down in Miami about the king and his minister, Louis the whatever and this guy Fouquet, the palace at Versailles and how the dumb party boy gets clapped in irons. It could be read very allegorically as a story about him. But what if he was talking about Tony or Johnny or Phil instead? What if the central lesson imparted in this story about never outshining the master had been one he took to heart? What if he had realized early on that he was never going to be taken seriously, so he might as well play the clown? What if he recognized that his father was right, that in the world of alpha males, he wasn't fit to command, that he would have to find another way to survive and thrive? What if he understood better than anyone else that the best way to rise to the top is to strike when absolutely expected, retire when prudent, to humbly submit, transparently fearful, peacefully retreating while the warriors do what warriors do, and their numbers dwindle with every clash? Suppose little Carmine had taken his own measure, accepted his limitations, and spent all that mental energy he would have used building up his own ego, analyzing the flaws and weaknesses of those around him instead. He challenges Johnny Sack's authority to tax Lorraine because it's expected. He lets Rusty Milio pour honey in his ear because that's what a vain man would do. And when things go too far and Angelo pays the price, he folds immediately because that's what's predicted of a coward. Little Carmine is nothing if not pleasant in person. He would never be so rude as to call Johnny Sack a greedy motherfucker to his face. He wouldn't poke the bear and tell his father he hasn't been afraid of him for quite some time. And there's no way he could critique Tony Soprano's own style of management either. Call him out on being a poseur and a tragically flawed monster. Certainly not when he can get Christopher Moltisanti to do his dirty work for him on the big screen. The stupidity that little Carmine demonstrates in his speeches, the staggering idiocy of his pronouncements, camouflages whatever intent lies behind his brain-dead eyes. Tony's hostility toward little Carmine's sideways comment about not knowing what kind of advice his father is getting from Johnny Sack is buried with the Versailles story. At the golf course, his casual demolition of Johnny's burgeoning alliance with Tony is written off as a spasm of envy, due in no small part to his mindless mention of Tony being very allegorical. At the premiere of Cleaver, he drowns any suspicion of malevolent mind games by rambling on about the movie being a baby, having many parents, and how the creepy figurine in the crucifix juxtaposes the sacred and the profane. It's entirely possible that little Carmine really is just a moron with an endless supply of luck, a favored son of fortune, one of the many fools God inexplicably chooses to protect. It's equally possible that the man is an absolute magician, a master of feigned ignorance, a maven of misdirection. If this is true, then what he does in the shadows will never come to light. The moves he makes off screen will never make it into the script. The truth is that little Carmine, whatever his motivations may be, is well positioned to do what he wants when the dust finally settles. If he chooses to continue his wet t-shirt contests and to print more DVDs under his South Beach strumpet subspecies, no one's going to stop him. If he wants to sit back and get fat on New York City graft, he's got enough contacts and name recognition to warrant a taste. And if he'd like to make another attempt at becoming boss or rule the Lupertazzi family by proxy, he only needs to step over the bodies of the fallen. The mind of little Carmine, such as it is, will forever remain murky. But the next time you're watching The Sopranos and he shows up on screen, ask yourself what's happening in that head of his. How well his words match his thoughts. Watch his eyes when he talks to people, the downward glance at the stormy sit-down with Phil that could be something besides embarrassment. Think about his tale of Versailles, the riddle-like nature of it. Notice the way he lights a cigar, the general drift of his body language. He says funny things, but is this man a joke? Is he the desperate last gasp of a once great dynasty? Or is he, quite possibly, simply a king who hasn't yet put on his crown?